The station master always insisted the line was safe. The tunnel was inspected, the signals were working, and the evening express had rolled out right on time. Hundreds of witnesses watched it leave the city that summer night in 1911, steam boiling around the platform lamps, families waving from the windows, the conductor's whistle cutting through the noise as the locomotive slid into the darkness. But at the next station down the line, the signal stayed stubbornly red, the platform stayed empty, and the express never arrived. Somewhere between one town and the next, an entire train had vanished. They called it the San Pietro Express, a routine mixed-class passenger train that left the capital just after sunset and followed a well-worn route through hills and farmland. On paper, there was nothing remarkable about that departure. The manifest showed merchants returning home, a handful of soldiers on leave, a priest, a small group of tourists, and railway staff who had made the journey 100 times before. Station ledgers noted the usual details in neat ink: departure time, expected arrival, locomotive number, coal load. For the clerks and telegraph operators, it was just one more line in a day filled with them. The only clue that this train would be different was something no one thought to write down at the time. The air over the tracks felt wrong, too still, too quiet. At the main station, the evening rush was in full swing. Porters pushed handcarts stacked with luggage, wheels rattling over iron grates. Vendors shouted last deals on newspapers and roasted chestnuts. A boy in an oversized cap weaved through the crowd, selling cheap postcards of locomotives, snarling smoke into the sky. Under the great iron and glass roof, the San Pietro Express waited on Platform 4, its boiler already hissing, a faint tremor running through the carriages as steam pressure built. Lamps glowed warm behind soot-streaked glass, illuminating faces pressed to windows. Some passengers looked bored, some excited, some already half asleep. On the platform, a telegraph operator named Lorenzo Bianchi paused to watch the scene. Years later, in a sworn statement, he would struggle to explain why this train had caught his eye. Perhaps it was the way the smoke from its stack rose straight up despite the breeze, or the way the light inside the carriages seemed slightly dimmer than it should have been, as if seen through tinted glass. He remembered a woman leaning from a window to wave at someone on the platform, her bracelet glinting briefly in the fading light. He remembered the station clock reading 1942 as the guard blew his whistle and shouted, "All aboard!" The departure itself went like clockwork. Signal levers clanged, points shifted with heavy metallic thuds, and the semaphore arm for Platform 4 rose to green. The driver gave 2 sharp blasts on the locomotive's whistle, a mournful wail that echoed off the vaulted roof. Wheels screeched, then gripped, and the train rolled forward, picking up speed as it glided past the end of the platform. Children ran alongside for a few steps, laughing, until a porter shooed them back. Then the express slid out into the open air, its tail lights shrinking as it headed toward the black mouth of the northern tunnel. The tunnel had been a source of local pride when it opened a decade earlier, a feat of engineering carved straight through a stubborn ridge of rock. At nearly 2 kilometers long, it cut journey times by more than an hour, replacing a twisting, hazard-prone climb. Engineers had reinforced its arch with thick stone and concrete, installed drainage channels, and built inspection niches at regular intervals. Official reports called it structurally sound and fit for all intended purposes. Train crews, less poetic, called it the throat. You entered in one world and came out in another, valley weather often radically different from city weather. But you always came out. That was the whole point. On this night, the approach to the tunnel looked ordinary. Trackmen patrolling earlier had reported nothing unusual, no rockfalls, no warped rails, no seepage strong enough to threaten the ballast. The entry signal showed clear. A lone shepherd on a nearby hill watched the express curve toward the mountains, a bright string of windows gliding through the coming dark. He would later tell investigators that as the locomotive reached the tunnel mouth, the sound changed. The familiar clatter and chuff seemed to stretch, flattening into a single long note that made the hairs rise on his arms. Then the engine plunged into the black throat of the mountain. The tail light vanished a moment later. The shepherd expected to hear the echo of the train within the tunnel. Instead, the night swallowed it. At the next station, San Lorenzo, the staff prepared for the routine arrival. The timetable pinned to the office wall showed the express due at 20:03. The station clock ticked steadily toward the top of the hour. A few passengers waited on the platform, a farmer with a crate of squawking chickens, a schoolteacher returning from a visit to the city, a pair of railway workers off shift. The station master, a precise man named Francesco Rossi, stood as he always did at this time on the platform edge, pocket watch in hand, listening for the first distant tremor of the approaching train. He never heard it. At 19:58, the line from the tunnel lay quiet, rails gleaming faintly in the lamplight. At 20 Foss, Rossi frowned and checked his watch against the station clock. They matched perfectly. At 20:03, the scheduled arrival time slipped past, and the only sound was the creak of cooling metal from an empty goods wagon sitting in a siding. No headlight appeared. No whistle echoed down the line. The teacher glanced at the clock, then down the tracks, then back again, annoyed but not yet alarmed. Trains ran late. It happened. Rossi stepped into the signal box. The telegraph sounder sat quiet, no requesting message from the previous station. According to protocol, he tapped out a simple query upstream. Express departed? They say some tunnels swallow more than echoes. On that night, in 1911, the stone throat of the mountain had taken the San Pietro Express whole, engine, carriages, passengers, without a single sound to mark its passing. When engineers walked the length of the tunnel at sunrise, their lanterns played over unbroken rails, cold walls dripping moisture, and the ordinary scuttling of rats and wind. Yet every step reminded them, a train weighing dozens of tons, filled with living people, had gone in and simply never emerged. No derailment, no crash, not a splinter of wood or scrap of metal on the tracks. Only silence. The news spread through the valley like a shockwave. The telegraph wires buzzed with frantic queries. Had the train been diverted? Had it stopped for repairs or emergency? Townsfolk gathered outside stations, eyes darting up and down the tracks, searching for signs. A distant whistle, a shimmer on the rails. Railway officials tried to answer, but the truth was impossible to hide. Investigators summoned from Milan and Rome arrived by midday, their automobiles kicking up clouds of dust as they sped to the tunnel, notebooks ready to record any clue. The tunnel itself became the heart of the investigation. Supervisors with decades in the business walked its length again and again, searching for evidence. The echo of their boots faded into the arched distance, their lanterns casting uncertain pools of light. Each inspection brought only frustration. There were no collapsed walls, no signs of sabotage, no hidden sidings where a train could vanish. Following strict protocols, they checked every inch of rail, every anchor bolt, every drainage channel. The sharp smell of oil and stone was everywhere. One engineer, Gianni Moretti, described the uncanny feeling. It was as if the air itself refused to carry sound, as if something heavy and invisible pressed down on us, like being watched by nothing. At the far side of the tunnel lay the empty continuation of the line, a straight stretch where the train should have burst into view, steam screaming and wheels trembling. Instead, the signal remained stubbornly red and the station clock ticked on. Investigators set up a communication line between stations, telegraph operators tapping out hourly queries. Status of missing train? Any sign northbound? Check all sidings. Answers streamed back, always the same. Negative. No unusual activity. No misrouted rolling stock. No plausible reason for a train to disappear. Attention shifted to the timetable and train manifest. Every passenger was accounted for. Local merchants, a priest traveling to his parish, several railway employees, tourists heading to a festival. Their names and destinations were carefully noted, their tickets collected. Relatives began to arrive at stations, demanding explanations. Some wept, others shouted. Railway officials could only point to the records. The train had departed, it should have arrived, but it had not. Panic simmered beneath the surface of official statements. Local police combed farms, ravines, and woods near the tracks, fearing foul play or some unheard-of accident. Volunteers joined the search, assembling in small parties and walking the line with dogs. At first, the theory was simple. The train had derailed or been forced off the tracks. Perhaps rain had softened the earth and allowed a collapse. Yet the evidence stubbornly refused to fit the scenario. No trace of disturbed earth was found, no dust clouds or toppled trees. The rails were unmarred, the ballast firm. It was as if the train had simply been erased. Authorities summoned railway experts, civil engineers, and local guides. Each explained there were only two logical possibilities. Either the express had not entered the tunnel, or it had emerged elsewhere. Neither option was true. Eyewitnesses in the city had seen the train depart. Eyewitnesses at the other station had waited, clocked, and certified its absence. A conductor named Alfredo Gianni gave a detailed statement. I saw it roll into the tunnel. The lights from the carriage windows faded, and then nothing more. And then the rumors began. Some swore to have seen strange lights moving deep in the tunnel during early morning hours, flickering like distant candles but gone before they could be reached. Others claimed to hear voices, urgent, fragmented, carried on otherwise empty air. An elderly trackman named Piero recounted a chill wind blowing at his back, colder than any breeze in midsummer, Superstition grew stronger as rational explanations failed. The investigation expanded. The railroad company ordered a shutdown of the line, diverting all traffic for days. Workers from nearby stops were called in to examine adjacent tunnels, suspect sightings, and storage yards miles away. When nothing surfaced, a group of investigators returned to the tunnel with surveyors' tools, determined to measure every deviation in its structure. If a missed door, a hidden maintenance shaft, or some forgotten construction could explain the event, it would be found. After a painstaking day of searches, not a single abnormality was recorded. Desperation led some to review previous incidents, accidents, delays, breakdowns on the line, but none matched the complete obliteration of a working train. In the railway archives, they found only stories of minor mishaps and delays years earlier. A freight car derailed during heavy rain, a locomotive's boiler ruptured in 1907, events neatly fixed and documented. What set the case apart was not evidence, but absence. Across the valley, families held vigils, hoping for a miraculous reappearance, as though the train might thunder out of the mountain at dawn. The local newspaper ran lurid headlines. The Vanishing Express. Train swallowed by the earth. Mystery in San Pietro Tunnel. Journalists interrogated the station master, the signal keeper, anyone who had been on duty. Opinions split. Was it a technical failure, a mistake, or something worse? As the hours became days, official responses stiffened. The search continues, they said, but hope fades. Engineers recommended sealing the tunnel for further safety checks. Policemen assured that every effort was being made, but beneath the surface, everyone knew. Never in modern times had the railway surrendered so completely to the unexplained. The final report issued that week read like a legal puzzle. Train departed at 1942, last seen entering tunnel at 1952, not seen exiting at 2003, all scheduled checks complete, no evidence of sabotage or collapse, search unsuccessful. The tracks were declared safe for traffic, but the missing train remained a hole in every official timetable that followed. The disappearance became legend, recounted in station houses on rainy nights, referenced by travelers glancing nervously at tunnel mouths. And while rational minds would eventually file it away as an unsolved incident, the tracks never quite felt the same again. Every railway line has its stories, small accidents, near misses, delays that become jokes in the signalman's hut. But what began to seep into the reports after the San Pietro Express vanished was different. It did not sound like rumor or superstition. It sounded like a pattern. A freight crew seeing a fully lit passenger train glide past them on a closed line. A signalman logging a green light where no train was scheduled. A station porter hearing the rush of wheels and wind, only to find empty tracks. One disappearance had become a mystery. The echoes that followed began to look like a haunting. The first official hint that something was badly wrong came 3 days after the disappearance. By then, the newspapers had filled their front pages with the story, and railway officials had retreated behind stiff statements. The line through the tunnel had reopened under strict speed restrictions, and every passing train carried an extra pair of eyes in the cab. On a foggy evening, a slow goods train approached the same stretch. Its driver, a veteran named Carlo Venturi, later described what he saw as like watching a memory happen in front of me. As his locomotive chugged along the valley floor, the tunnel mouth still a distant shadow ahead, Carlo glanced across to the parallel track. There, less than 100 meters away and heading in the same direction, ran another train. Not a ghostly blur or a suggestion. An entire passenger express, headlights bright, windows glowing warm against the gathering dusk. For a heartbeat, he thought traffic control had made a serious error, routing 2 trains onto the same direction line. His firemen saw it too. They both stared, mouths open, as the other train matched their speed. Carlo remembered details. A woman in an elaborate hat peering out, an officer in uniform reading a newspaper, a child pressing a hand to the glass. The livery on the carriages was from another decade, slightly old-fashioned but freshly painted. Then, without any change in sound, the other train seemed to slide sideways. No screech of brakes, no sparks, and simply wasn't there. One instant, it filled the length of track beside them. The next, there was only fog and steel. The rails were bare, the ballast undisturbed. When Carlo reported the incident at the next station, the duty inspector looked at him as if he had lost his mind. There had been no orders for a second train, no signals cleared on the parallel line, no track occupancy errors. The logbooks insisted only one train had been in that sector. Carlo, normally a calm man, refused to move his locomotive again until his statement was taken in full. The company added the report to the growing file under a new heading: Uncorroborated Sightings. It would not be the last. Weeks turned into months. Families of the vanished passengers drifted away, some accepting compensation, others clinging to protests that felt smaller with each passing day. Official inquiries slowed, then stalled. Yet along the line, strange incidents continued. A signalman at a rural box swore he had seen the board for the tunnel section flip briefly to occupied at 20:03 one evening, the exact scheduled arrival time of the lost express at San Lorenzo, despite no train being anywhere near his sector. The indicator clattered, showed track occupied for a few seconds, then flicked back to clear on its own. He did what any conscientious man would. He checked his equipment, suspecting a mechanical fault. Wires, relays, linkage rods, all in order. When he filed a fault report, maintenance crews found nothing. The signalman eventually stopped talking about it. Colleagues already teased him for hearing trains in the wires. Stories began to spread beyond the official reports. A night watchman at a small station swore that, on certain anniversaries, he could hear the distant crescendo of an approaching express shortly before midnight. Station windows rattling a little, the air pressure in his booth changing, only for the noise to roll through and fade away with no headlight ever appearing. Once, he said, tickets on a shelf near the door rustled as if brushed by a gust from a passing train. When he opened the door, the platform lay empty under the stars. Not everyone who saw something reported it up the chain. A group of workers repairing track near the tunnel exit one autumn afternoon looked up to see, just for a moment, a cloud of steam billowing from the mouth as if a locomotive had just passed. No train was due. No whistle had sounded. The men eyed one another, silently agreed they had all imagined it, and went back to their tools. But some incidents could not be ignored. In a town far from San Pietro, a station master in another region of the country wrote an uneasy letter to headquarters. One night, he wrote, a train had roared through his station without slowing, lights burning in every carriage. It was not on any timetable. He and his staff had seen the faces inside, people dressed in old-fashioned clothes, some staring straight ahead, others seemingly oblivious. The locomotive bore no clear number in the darkness. By the time he reached for his lantern and tried to catch more detail, the taillight had already vanished into the distance. The following morning, he checked with Central Dispatch. No extra trains had been scheduled. No deviation orders had been issued. The tracks beyond his station showed no record of additional traffic. The official reply to his letter was polite but firm. You must have mistaken a delayed service. Yet no such delay appeared in any log. Whispers started to knit these scattered events together. Railway staff who moved between stations traded stories during meal breaks. Did you hear about the driver near the coast who saw a second train in his mirrors? They say a porter in the Northeast found cigarette smoke in an empty carriage right after one of those phantom times. Each story, taken alone, could be dismissed as fatigue, imagination, a trick of light. Together, they resembled something else, fragments of a single, looping phenomenon rippling across the network. Some tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the grief of the families and the pressure on staff had primed everyone to see patterns where none existed. Human minds, after all, are adept at finding faces in clouds and meaning in coincidences. Supervisors reminded crews that long shifts could play tricks on the senses. The official lost train file gathered dust in an archive cabinet, its existence acknowledged but rarely discussed. Yet there was one detail that kept resurfacing, a small numerical echo buried in different testimonies. When staff noted the time of their disturbances, the phantom signals, the echoing roars, the impossible glimpses of carriages, their clocks often showed times closely matching the old schedule of the San Pietro Express. The vanished train seemed to be haunting its own timetable, replaying its last intended journey in fractured flashes that brushed against reality and then slipped away. In the capital, a junior clerk with an interest in unusual cases began to collect these notices. Between routine tasks, he copied the relevant lines into a private notebook. Date, time, location, description. Over months, a pattern emerged, a faint yet undeniable curve across the map. Reports clustered near junctions, tunnels, and major stops the express should have passed. He drew a line to connect them. It traced, with unsettling accuracy, the original route. What unnerved him more was the way the reports seemed to move with time. Early on, sightings were more frequent near the tunnel and San Lorenzo. Later, they began to surface farther along the line, even on connecting branches. It was as if the missing train were still out there somewhere, endlessly trying to complete a journey it had never finished, occasionally bleeding into the tracks we know before sliding away again. The clerk brought his notebook to a superior one rainy afternoon, expecting to be laughed out of the office. Instead, the older man leafed through the pages silently, jaw set. When he finished, he closed the notebook carefully. "You've been thorough," he said. "Too thorough for a story like this." "A story, sir?" the clerk asked. The man nodded. "That's what it has to remain. An accident with no wreckage is bad enough. A train that won't stay gone, that's worse. People need to believe the timetable means something. Doors open, trains arrive, trains depart. The rest," he tapped the notebook, "does not go in the ledgers." They locked the notes away. Officially, the San Pietro Express was still listed as lost, presumed destroyed in an unobserved incident. Unofficially, the railway community carried the weight of a different possibility, that somewhere along the steel veins of the network, a single night in 1911 had never really ended. And every so often, when a driver glanced in his mirror and thought he saw lights pacing his train where no line existed, or when a signal creeped to "occupied," with no wheels on the track, the same unspoken thought flickered across tired faces in control rooms and cabins. Maybe the missing express was passing through again, just out of phase, a few inches, a few seconds, or a few realities away. Whether the railway wanted it or not, the mystery of the vanishing train had slipped the bounds of one tunnel and one valley. It now lived in sidings and signal boxes hundreds of miles apart, in the quiet terror of men who knew tracks better than their own homes, and still occasionally looked down at polished steel and wondered what might be running on lines no map could show. They finally opened the file because they ran out of ways to ignore it. For 20 years, the disappearance of the San Pietro Express had been treated as a bad joke in official circles, a story for bored night shifts and drunk journalists, safely sealed behind the words, "Unsolved Incident." But when the same train began appearing in reports from different regions, different decades, and different rail systems, all describing the same impossible details, the joke stopped being funny. Somewhere between myth and paperwork, the ghost of a timetable had become too loud to bury. The man who gave the case a second life wasn't a famous detective or a politician looking for headlines. He was an archivist, the kind of person history usually forgets. His name doesn't matter as much as his habit. He hated loose ends. Working in a cramped records office that smelled of paper dust and machine oil, he spent his days cataloging old railway documents, incident reports, telegraph logs, internal memos. One rainy afternoon, he noticed something odd. A faded folder from the 1930s mentioned "Unexplained Express Sighting near Volterra, alignment to lost San Pietro schedule." A note in the margin referred to "Previous Incident 1911, see file L17." Curious, he went looking for L17. The original disappearance file was still there, its cardboard edges softened by time. Inside lay everything the first investigators had gathered: witness statements from engineers and station masters, maps of the tunnel, photographs of the valley, the final timetable. The archivist read it all, then compared it to the later, unexplained express report. Same kind of train, same approximate time of evening, same route line on the map. Then he checked a third document, this one from the 1950s, in which a signalman described phantom occupancy on a track section long after scheduled traffic had ceased. The report ended with a hesitant sentence: "Pattern resembles events of San Pietro Express, but cause unknown." Patterns were his specialty. Within weeks, he had pulled half a dozen similar reports from different decades. Strange trains, seen where none were scheduled, signals flipping to "occupied" for 3 minutes at a time with no physical train present, passengers reporting the sound and wind of an express that left no wake. Some documents had been dismissed as equipment failure, others as stress-induced mistakes. Yet the times and locations lined up too neatly to ignore. Each incident hovered along the old San Pietro route like beads on a wire. He took his findings to his superior, expecting a lecture about imagination and the dangers of letting stories contaminate records. Instead, the older man frowned, took off his glasses, and sat back slowly. He'd been young when the original disappearance happened and remembered the panic, the funerals with no bodies, the way the company quietly paid out compensation. "You know why this file was buried?" he asked. "Because the rails run on trust. People must believe that when a timetable says a train will go from A to B, it will arrive, late, broken, whatever, but there. A train that can simply vanish, worse, one that might still be running. That's poison to the whole system." Still, the evidence on the archivist's desk demanded attention. A compromise emerged, an internal review, unofficial, off the books. They would reopen the San Pietro file, but only to understand whether these scattered anomalies shared a root cause. Publicly, nothing changed. Privately, a new working group formed. 2 railway engineers, an inspector from the Transport Ministry, a mathematician interested in complex systems, and the archivist who had started it all. They began with the hard data: times, locations, weather conditions, signal readings. One engineer pinned a long strip of paper to the wall and drew parallel lines for each decade. Along them, he marked every incident the team could verify, each unexplained signal change, each sighting of a non-existent train, with a small red slash. The pattern was eerie. Incidents clustered around key points: the original tunnel, major junctions, and the old San Pietro terminus. Even more unsettling was the rhythm. The most reliable reports all described disturbances lasting roughly 3 minutes, almost exactly the scheduled interval between the tunnel entry and the next station back in 1911. The mathematician approached the problem differently. He fed the times and positions into a basic model, treating the vanished train as a system that had never completed its route. If, he mused, something had happened to its world line, the path it took through time and space, what would that look like on paper if occasional fragments brushed against later trains and equipment? The simulation spat out curves and spikes that meant little to anyone who didn't live in equations, but to him they suggested something unnerving. The anomalies were not random. They clustered as if orbiting an invisible track, one that intersected the real rails at predictable but infrequent points. They interviewed old railway staff while they still could. Retired drivers in cramped apartments recalled strange nights, when monitors flickered and the radios filled with static for no reason. A former dispatcher, now in his 80s, admitted that he had once received a clear block request from a train code that hadn't been used since the 1910s. "I thought it was a prank," he said, hands shaking slightly. "But when I asked for repetition, the line went dead. Then the panel in front of me blinked track occupied for 3 minutes on the San Pietro section. We had no trains there at all that night." Not everyone welcomed the renewed scrutiny. Higher up the chain, some officials argued that digging into a century-old mystery would only invite sensationalism and undermine public confidence. "Are we in the business of running trains or chasing ghosts?" one executive snapped during a closed-door meeting. But another, a woman who had spent much of her career in accident investigation, was blunt. "If there is even the slightest chance that these anomalies hint at a real safety risk, equipment malfunctions, hidden structural failures, we are obligated to understand them." They never closed the file. Officially, the San Pietro Express became a historical footnote, a line in old accident ledgers, a cautionary tale for dispatchers. Unofficially, the case sat in a gray metal cabinet with a handwritten warning across the spine: "Do not destroy." Every few years, someone opened that drawer, ran a hand over the brittle pages, and asked the same quiet question: if a train can vanish once, what stops it from happening again? By the time our story reaches the present day, the railway that once carried the San Pietro Express has been modernized almost beyond recognition. Wooden sleepers replaced by concrete, semaphore arms by LED signals, dispatchers by computers. The old tunnel has been reinforced and wired with sensors. Control rooms glow blue with screens that track every axle on every train in real time. To most of the staff now, the 1911 disappearance is an urban legend, something older engineers mutter about when systems glitch at 3 a.m. But buried in a subfolder of the digital incident database, there is a flagged tag that refuses to die. Ref 1911 SP Express Anomaly. The modern anomalies are smaller, more subtle, and easier to blame on software. A block section shows occupied for exactly 3 minutes when no train is scheduled. A driver's onboard unit briefly lists a phantom service code before refreshing. A CCTV camera at a rural station catches 3 frames, no more, of a blurred string of lit windows racing through an empty platform, time-stamped to a minute that no train should pass. Each incident is logged, analyzed, assigned a likely cause: packet loss, sensor fault, human error. Yet the engineers who know the old story notice something else. The rogue timestamps line up on a graph, forming the faint outline of a timetable that no longer exists. One young systems engineer, fascinated by the pattern, decides to do what the earlier archivist did with paper, only now with data. On his own time, he pulls anonymized logs from the last decade, every unexplained 3-minute occupancy, every ghost service identifier, every piece of telemetry that doesn't match a physical train. He strips away obvious hardware failures and maintenance tests, then overlays the remainder on a map of the network. The result makes his skin prickle. The anomalies trace the old San Pietro route with unnerving accuracy, including long-closed sidings and bypass loops that only exist on archival diagrams. He digs deeper. In the archives, he finds the original hand-drawn timetable: departure at 1942, Tunnel entry at 1952, scheduled arrival at the next station at 24:03. When he normalizes the modern anomaly times for changes in daylight saving and timetable shifts, something clicks. The 3-minute blips tend to fall at intervals that mirror the original stopping pattern, as if some unseen service were still requesting blocks along an invisible line. It is not perfect, not clean enough for a scientific paper, but as a story, as a shape in the noise, it is terrifyingly persuasive. When he quietly shares his findings with a veteran dispatcher, the older man listens in silence, then leans back and stares at the ceiling. "We've joked for years that the system sometimes remembers old trains," he says. "Paths that were used so often the steel itself still knows them. None of us put it in reports because it sounds like this." He taps the printout of the map. But when the screens flicker at 20:03 and a block goes red where nothing should be, we all know which train we think of. Theories proliferate, as they always do when evidence is thin and stakes are high. The hard-headed insist on mundane explanations, correlated hardware faults, bad code, confirmation bias. More speculative minds ask wilder questions. Could a catastrophic field around the tunnel have displaced the train in time rather than space? Could the express be trapped in some looping branch of reality, endlessly running its last route and brushing against our network whenever its vanished timetable overlaps with the present? Physics offers no comforting answers, only the knowledge that, on very small scales, particles do strange things when their paths are observed. No one has a model for what happens when a 100-ton locomotive and 100 human lives encounter a similar fracture. Families of the original passengers are mostly gone now, their grief scattered across cemeteries and forgotten addresses. But once in a while, a great-grandchild turns up at the archives, clutching a faded photograph of an ancestor who boarded the San Pietro Express and never came home. They ask if anything new has been found. The official answer is always the same: nothing conclusive. The unofficial answer is more complicated. New data keeps arriving. New glitches keep tracing the outline of an old route. The story has not ended so much as thinned out, becoming part of the background noise of the railway itself. For the people who work closest to the rails, the legend expresses itself in small rituals. A few drivers, when rostered on the late run that passes the old tunnel around the fateful minute, will reach up and tap the timetable clipped above the cab window, as if to anchor themselves more firmly to the present. Some signalers, if an unexplained 3-minute occupancy appears on their screens, will quietly note SP in the margin of their logbook, then clear the block and say nothing more. No one wants to be the one who turns a superstition into an incident. And yet beneath the superstition lies a question that refuses to close. If a system as engineered and measured as a national railway can produce an event that doesn't fit into its own diagrams, what does that say about everything else we trust without thinking? About clocks, schedules, cause and effect? The San Pietro Express undermines more than just faith in steel and timetables. It pokes at the idea that the world is a single, continuous track from yesterday to tomorrow. It suggests there might be sidings we cannot see, loops we have never mapped, places where a journey can slip sideways and never rejoin the main line. In the final pages of the reopened file, those written not for courts or boards, but for whoever might inherit the problem, one investigator leaves a note. It is not a conclusion, just an observation. Whether the San Pietro Express was destroyed, displaced, or never truly understood, its absence continues to generate effects. Signals that do not correspond to trains that do not correspond to any schedule. The system behaves as if a service is still booked, still demanding right-of-way. Perhaps the safest assumption is the simplest. As long as the timetable for that night exists in any form, in ink, in habit, in the memory of metal, its ghost will continue to run. So the file stays in the cabinet. The tunnel stays in service, lined with concrete and sensors and the hum of modern power. Trains roar through it every day, their passengers scrolling through phones, unaware that their carriages are passing through the exact space where another train once failed to emerge. If they glance up and see nothing but darkness outside, they do not think to imagine another set of windows moving alongside theirs, just out of phase, full of people from another century who never completed their journey. And if you ever find yourself on a late train, watching the clock tick toward a time that no longer appears on any modern schedule, and the lights flicker as you enter a long, cold tunnel, you might feel a pressure in your ears and a strange, momentary sense that you are not alone on the line. When the feeling passes and your train bursts back into open air, you will probably laugh and blame the electrics. Somewhere, in a control room, you will never see. A block indicator may have briefly glowed red with no train attached to it. Someone will clear it, add 3 quiet minutes to a log, and close the window. The world will move on. The rails will keep shining. But in a thick folder behind a locked drawer, the San Pietro Express will continue to demand a place on the network. One more unsolved case in the ledger of reality, still refusing to arrive.